G'day guys, welcome to Chalk Talks, where I talk blacksmithing, bladesmithing, metallurgy and more. If you're interested in this series, make sure to hit the subscribe button to be notified of when I upload new episodes. Today, we're talking about blade design. Blades come in many forms. As we know, this is only a very small representative sample of the various types of blade profile you will find in the world. But these 6 basic shapes can have so many variations that still fit within these categories that they cover the majority of shapes that you will come across. So obviously, from the top left here, we have the drop, the spear, and the clip points. And then we have Wharncliffe, sheep's foot, and a Kisaki, which is basically a modified drop point, if we're being realistic. And a Kisaki tip is sometimes known as a Tanto profile, although traditional Tanto did not have Kisaki. But we'll get into that at a later date. Suffice it to say, these blade profiles are the very basic of what you will come across when you start bladesmithing. And it's important to understand that each of these styles of blade have a very specific purpose. And that purpose is the most important thing when coming up with your blade profile. One of the things I want to detail in this video is talking about designing your knife after the purpose rather than designing the purpose after the knife. So basically, don't make a hunter that has a sheep's foot profile because a sheep's foot profile isn't, conducive to the use of hunting. You can use it, but it's not going to be as good as, say, a spear point, drop point, or clip point. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into each one of these shapes and discuss their advantages and disadvantages. So as I said at the start, there are so many different variations of the various categories in which we put knives that this knife here, which has an ostensibly straight spine, could be considered a drop point, even though the point doesn't drop. This blade here, where the top curves all the way almost down to the edge, with only having a slight rise in edge, is still considered a spear, where it's almost very much closer to a sheep's foot or Wharncliffe design. The way we differentiate blade designs is basically based on personal preference, but most of the time it's designated by the position of the tip in relation to the center line of the knife. So if we were to say, this is the center line of our knives, a drop point is always going to have its tip slightly above the center line of the knife. And this allows for a larger belly cutting surface, right? Most commonly seen in hunting knives and stuff like that. You can have quite pronounced drop points that have blades much like this. Machete-like blades are technically drop points because the point still stays ahead of the center line of the knife and provides that large belly for slicing. It's also good for chopping in the event that we have a large blade, but that's more about blade size than profile. A spear point will normally have the blade at or below the center line. Now, obviously, the moment that the edge becomes straight, so if we come to here, if that tip falls all the way there, that becomes a sheep's foot. Both sheep's foot and Wharncliffe designs have straight edges, right? They are naturally straight edged, sometimes with a little bit of belly, like in a Santoku, but most of the time they're going to be as close to straight as possible. The drop point and spear point designs are some of the most ubiquitous designs you will find in knives today and throughout history, going back to the early Bronze Age. The reason for such is that they provide both penetrative power with the tip, obviously not with a large bellied knife like that, but with the original profile, you've got quite a fine tip for penetration, same with the spear point, but also enough belly that slicing is possible. And slicing is incredibly popular in knives because knives were designed to cut. In most situations, a drop point or spear point knife will do the job. Perhaps not the best, but it's much like the jack of all trades, master of none, better than a master of one. These designs are going to hold out in most situations against their competitors. The disadvantages to, say, a drop point is that you lose somewhat of your tip strength because you have to basically narrow that section of the blade in order to continue giving it a good cutting profile. Spear points tend to have slightly more robust blades, whilst being a little bit more obtuse in profile. They provide a little bit more strength behind the edge, which is why most daggers are spear pointed. You can have a drop pointed dagger. One of the perfect examples would be Bob Lovelace's Bear Killer fighting knife, which is a drop pointed dagger ground blade. But most daggers are going to be spear pointed to provide that little bit of extra rigidity and a little bit of extra strength to the point. Spears, whilst more robust at the tip, have less of a belly, which allows for less of a slicing movement when using them, say, for skinning and that kind of thing. So drop points are much more common when you're talking about hunting knives. Understanding the difference between a drop point and a spear point comes down to understanding the differences in usability, difference in utility. And this is going to be the overarching message of this video, is understanding the purpose for which you want to use this knife. So if you're designing a knife for hunting, both of these will work, but a drop point will be better for skinning, and a spear point will be better for puncturing things. Much the same as drop points and spear points, the variation in tip level can be used in clip points. Now, obviously, with a clip point, you're always referring to something that has either a swept or straight section to the spine of the knife, normally a third, maybe a half at maximum of the length of the blade, that is normally sharpened, sometimes called the false edge, and basically provides a slightly narrower tip profile than a standard spear point or drop point. The main advantage of a clip point is simply that slightly narrower tip profile to increase the penetration power whilst not sacrificing the belly of an otherwise drop point profile. This is, of course, only if the tip is higher than the center line. But if you look at a lot of Bowie designs and clip point knife designs all over the world, including pocket knife designs, you will find a variation in the height of clip based on the utility that it was supposed to be used for. A lower tip allows itself for more chopping tasks, where the edge is going to be meeting the surface hard, and rather than being sliced, it's going to be chopping into something. A central tip profile is going to allow for a thrust better. It's going to align with the hand as the hand is driving the knife forward, and it's going to provide a better penetrative power. So in, for instance, boar hunting knives, they tend to have, if they have a clip point, have it fairly central to the blade because it's a good place for providing that force directly to the handle. A clip point that has the clip raised to almost the spine level is accenting that belly. It's accenting that slicing power, the ability to have the maximum amount of pounds per square inch on a small area of the blade, because a larger curved area requires smaller surface contact with the area that it's cutting. Now, a clip doesn't always have to be scooped like these. It can be dead straight like this one, or it can be harpooned where the clip point actually raises above the spine of the knife, all of which are clip points, and all of which are purely to accent that tip profile, whether it's simply through the sharpening of that clip point to provide a narrower tip profile, or whether it's to drop that tip and still have that belly for cutting. Most of the time, clip points are going to be used in fighting knives or as an aesthetic choice. For instance, in pocket knives and that kind of thing, clip points, especially raised clip points like this one, are used quite commonly to continue having a belly, but also provide that little bit of a narrow profile for when you're trying to punch through your cardboard box to open it up. Clip points, for the most part, yeah, it will be dedicated fighting knives. Sometimes clip points can be used in hunting. I use a clip point knife for my hunting. And having that sharpened clip sometimes can be useful if you have the ability to sharpen your clip. That is a legality issue, not a blade design issue. Check with your local ordinances on that one. But yeah, clip point knives can be multi-purpose because again, all you're doing is taking a standard drop point or spear point design and cutting a little bit out of the tip to provide a little bit more penetrative power. The Wharncliffe and Sheep's Foot designs are designs purely around accenting the edge over the blade profile. Both of these can be found quite regularly in the use in like wood carving, for instance. For chip carving and whittling, a lot of the time you'll find Wharncliffe blades being quite popular. Sheep's foot blades, quite common on old pocket knives, especially stockmans and traders and stuff like that. Again, accenting that straight edge, much like a chisel, makes it really good for the application of wood carving. Sheep's foot blades are also quite common in marine knives where cutting rope and that kind of thing is necessary, and on first responder knives where you may have to cut a seatbelt from someone and slide the knife between the seatbelt and the person. You don't want to be able to dig the tip into someone's flesh. So you'll normally find sheep's foot blades where the tip is at the edge rather than the tip being in the middle. The reason they don't use Wharncliffes is obviously because Wharncliffe is simply a sheep's foot that has a more accented tip, which allows for easier narrow detail carving, but also increases the amount of penetrative power it has, which is not good for safety. Both of these blades, as I said, in their standard configuration are dead straight edged, which makes them fairly easy to sharpen because you have no rounded profile to follow. You just simply lay it flat on the stone and go away. Off you go. This provides a significant advantage, as I said, in sharpening and in use in woodworking, but provides a disadvantage in cutting anything that requires to cut to a flat surface. You'd think flat blade cutting on flat surface helpful, but if you imagine, it's very difficult to get full surface contact on a piece when cutting, say, meat or bread or something like that. It also means that there's going to be more surface area contact with the piece that you're cutting. Whereas a santoku, which is a sheep's foot bladed chef's knife, and then you have gyuto, which are basically Wharncliffe bladed knives, they are very slightly bellied and could be considered spear points at this point. And this is where that kind of odd variation comes in. But I would still consider these two Wharncliffe and sheep's foot designs respectively. But that little bit of an added belly allows for better slicing capabilities, and you would have found that if you've ever tried to make a santoku with a dead straight edge. It doesn't cut very well, and the tip tends to dig into the chopping board before anything else, because remember, the tip is leading in these cases. The tip, in this case, you know, even with a almost dead flat end, still has a very sharp tip there, and if you're pushing the knife, that tip is going to be the first thing that contacts the surface. So if you're going to design a knife with a Wharncliffe or sheep's foot blade, ensure that you're specializing it for a certain task that normally doesn't require slicing cuts and more requires push cuts. A Kisaki style tip or Tanto style tip is basically just a drop point with two angles, right? It's very little different. The reason I added this one into this video is more as a bonus than anything else. Realistically, it can be used exactly the same way as a drop point, in that it has a cutting surface, but it's got an angled cutting surface. It's not going to be great for slicing, although it does have two narrow points rather than having one narrow point and a long sweep. Traditional Tanto are actually flat ground and are basically just drop points. That is what a traditional Tanto would look like. The Kisaki is more common in katana and wakizashi, the larger swords, and that is to provide a slightly more robust tip whilst continuing the angle of the blade up the tip. But This profile, I don't think is useful for pretty much anything except looking good. The majority of the Kisaki style tips you'll find in modern day are on tactical knives and stuff like that. Basically what I call sharpened pry bars. Or you will find them on Usuba and, the various Japanese kitchen knives based around this grind, but then that grind is very specifically for one purpose, cutting fish or cutting meat in normal circumstances. So if you're going to make one of these, go for it, but it's not the best cutting profile for pretty much any purpose that we would come into these days. That's just my opinion. So, to round out this video, I think I'd just go over the details again, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and that I haven't ranted a little bit too much over this. Basically, blade design comes down to these 4 points: the spine, the tip, the belly, and the heel. The more curved towards the belly your spine is, the lower your point will be. The lower your point will be, the more chopping power it has, the less slicing power it has. Inverse to that is the belly. The more curved the belly, the more slicey the knife will be, the less choppy or less stabby it will be, right? Obviously, the larger curves and the more obtuse curves on the spine and belly, the less tip profile you're gonna have. The tip is simply an angle, right? You have an angle between the spine and the belly. That angle can be narrow, that angle can be wide. It all depends on whether you want the tip to be able to easily penetrate things or to be robust and assist in cutting. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention that I haven't yet is the heel. The heel of a knife is incredibly important, especially on things like kitchen knives. And one of the things that I see a lot of in production kitchen knives on the market today is that the heel is regularly in front of the plunge, like behind the plunge line, right? So you have this thick section of material at the heel. Now this can be helped with a Spanish notch, where you take out a portion of the edge. I'll draw another blade here. So if we imagine that this is the end of the blade, this is your plunge line, you can create a Spanish notch in there to assist with sharpening. But in most cases, having the plunge line come behind the heel, back here, right, back here, is going to assist you in that it means that you're not going to impact the stone or impact your sharpening media on that material behind the heel of the blade. The heel is also a really important point for cutting. If you've ever seen a Chinese cleaver, for instance, being used, quite regularly they will use the heel as the thing to pierce things with rather than the tip. So when designing your blade, ensure that all 4 of these points are working together to provide you your best use. If you're trying to design a blade that is for slicing meat and for processing like game, for skinning and stuff like that, you perhaps want a larger belly with a slightly more obtuse tip in order to prevent it puncturing through the skin. And you want a free heel, so you want that ability to easily sharpen in the field. So basically making sure that all of these design points intersect in a way that best performs in the utility that you want to use it for is going to provide the best outcome for the customer. And that's the most important thing. You want your customers to walk away happy. So in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about how this relates to handle material and how it relates to handle design. As I said in the beginning of this video, if you want to follow me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell icon to be notified of when I upload new videos. Massive thank you to my patrons, who I'm going to list over here. They are the ones who actually gave me this idea and many more to come. So if you want to help me come up with ideas for Chalk Talks, if you want to have access to the behind the scenes videos and stuff like that, feel free to join my Patreon. The support is greatly appreciated and honestly makes it so that I can keep continuing to give this kind of information. But with that being said, I hope you all have a fantastic week. I will see you next time with another Chalk Talk. See you guys.